I actually I've turned it off at the moment because I just find, man, my brain's too ADHD. Like I did maybe one or two live streams, and then like while talking, the chat keeps going on. I've got to get used to like learning to engage with first make my point and then chat. Yeah, man. Like all right. So I guess as I was saying before we went live, I do appreciate like how you try to sort of really patiently and one would even say punctiliously work through ideas, think them out. But then the thing is, I don't know. Part of me, okay, so I'll put it this way, right? This is gonna sound a bit like wanky, but generally the people that I find who are a bit more the cerebral types like yourself, who are more into like philosophy or science or like the academic types, as far as I know, all of my friends within that circle or that ilk just completely have switched off politics. Like they barely even talk about politics. They're interested in some niche academic field, like whatever, neuroscience or something, right? And I think a part of that is like a resignation out of despondency. Whereas I would say I have this similar despondency with me. Like I'm kind of in a place of mourning in a way especially after Trump's second victory, and then, like all the anti-immigrant stuff, trans stuff, and all of this. But then I also feel like, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Like, I feel like there's some sort of like ethical obligation for us to engage in the political sphere, because fundamentally human beings, we are social beings. Like, I mean, I don't think we can just like in like this lock ourselves away from the world and just like, I don't know, go and be like a fucking monk or something, like meditate. Like, I think we are part of the social, and we kind of have in a way, like a moral or ethical duty to engage and be like a part of civic society. And right now, I'm interested in educating myself, but I'm also trying to learn how to engage, in this way. So, and then I've seen you been doing it. So I guess what do you see your role as like as a citizen, but also kind of this political engagement thing you're doing online? What do you try to, in a way, achieve out of that?
I think, those are questions I don't know if I have completely clear answers to. So I'll be working it out a little bit, even, which is good for me to do sort of in a conversation like this, I guess. But so I've been reading recently a little bit of Aristotle on politics, right? And obviously, there's plenty of things he says that I think are weird. But one thing that I think is kind of cool and probably what I think is right is that sort of politics is sort of almost like a sociological wrapper around your kind of like ethical values or something, right? And so I think our politics kind of reflect what the workings out of our values look like when we consider humans living together according to those values. So I kind of begin with, I think, certain values that I have in a similar way to how allegedly Aristotle's meant to have been. I mean, so all of the writings we have of Aristotle, it's not clear if he wrote them or if they're like like there's all, but I think similarly I sort of have some loose kind of considerations in terms of my values where I think that there are duties that I have towards living people and other living organisms as well. I do have slightly different feelings about them where, like, I think I have a sort of moral sense. I don't think I'm sensing but I have a moral sentiment that say vegetative life is good and shouldn't be destroyed. But I don't hold that in the same sort of esteem as I would hold like a dog's life or a human's life, whatever. So I care about sort of like trying to enable life to flourish. This is something I get a little bit from Albert Schweitzer as well, because he talks about he comments a lot on civilization from this like high German culture point of view. But what he's talking about is like a reverence for life and how that enables one to expand the circle of their compassion beyond not just the individual, but also beyond humanity to other things. And I mean, it's hard for me to, I don't think that these things can be rationally justified. I think it's wrong to think that our ethical views are often, rationally justified. I think there's aesthetic components to them. There's all sorts of contingent historical components to them. But I begin with sort of these kind of considerations about caring about life and others. And also there's elements of that are to do with myself. But then I recognize, say, aspects of myself, my own psychology, which I think are bad and that I should work on. I recognize the causes of those sorts of things and how they depend on social relations or support networks and things like that. And so all of these kind of ethical considerations then fit together in my reasoning about, well, what's going on in the world? How does it all fit together? What are the major causes of what's going on? And I do think that then that provides me with a bunch of things that I care about, which are, trying to persuade other people who are in communities to similarly want to be engaged. That's one thing. Trying to persuade them of some of those values if I think they've got blind spots. Trying to actually influence the institutions that have the ability to change these things. Now, that is often done through voting, but I think a big thing is, I think you're right in terms of this sense of despondency a lot of people have. And a lot of that, I think, is just persuading people to be engaged, right? To actually take some responsibility for the world they live in and run for local office, get involved in your council. At the end of the day, all of these things are people who are doing things and making choices. And you need people with the values that you think are good to get involved in those things if you want to make the systems tilt or be biased in those directions, right? So in terms of what I think I'm doing, I hope that I'm encouraging people to want to actually get involved in their local politics. There is a sort of tension or worry because some of my criticisms of what I see is going on politically are that I think that basically our world is very sick in a number of ways. And a part of that sickness that I see is our dependence and relationship to information technologies. So how we consume our information, our relationships with the people, which are through screens, how we do our work, but then also the way that all of those things are held together by services which are owned by companies which are incentivized to capture data on us, trade us as products to advertisers for them to get rich. All of those things combine into some quite complicated systems that I think count against human flourishing. They and actively harm people and promote systems of thought and ways of being, which I think are actually, I don't know if anti-life is the right way of saying it, but it's kind of like, it's buy more and aspire to live on a yacht, polluting everyone else, not thinking about, those who are suffering. Don't seek a more just world. Be jealous of the people around you. Don't cultivate a set of skills that you're actually good at and contribute to your community. Be like a performative person who wakes up at this time and does all of this performative bullshit.
I have a bit to say on that too. Yeah.
So the tension, right, in what I'm doing is that I am on these platforms communicating in that way, and there is some sense of community that I get out of the way that I engage with people. And I do worry about this, is just participating in that mode of political debate just a continuation of contribution to the problem? I mean, when you were talking about my engagement with, say, Andrew Wilson, right? I have reflected on that and thought, hang on, is this just kind of theatre essentially that does nothing to change anyone's mind, but then it turns these values, what I would say my values being about trying to enable people to live peacefully with one another. I would say Andrew's values being about having some real messed up psychology and wanting to hurt others for various complicated reasons. And it takes those things which should matter and it just turns them into a product, right? Which is a little bit of people's attention that then people can commentate on. Audiences can be looped into the feedback system by being sent to channels to leave a comment, get angry, get riled up, then come and hear your creator. And I do think like, is the juice worth the squeeze with some of those sorts of things? Like, should I be so basically, this is all to say I am being as careful as I can with my engagement on these platforms to try and avoid that stuff. But I also think that there is some good to be done in either helping people to deconstruct from some of those views, see blind spots in them, and also encouraging people who are despondent. I think sometimes people will just feel ungaslit by hearing someone identify these things that they see as problems, but they only see this kind of hyper real like media presentation of in other forms, and that can be quite empowering for someone and give them a bit of motivation to do something that will have a little bit of an impact or a chance of an impact in some way,
Yeah, because I certainly can see that you do. In fact, in a couple of your streams, you sort of kind of like what you're doing now. You think out like, should I even engage with like, the kind of the critical, self-critical lens? And in my view, that kind of like hermeneutic questioning, we should constantly do that, like regardless of where we engage in. Because my problem, I think, is the kind of the almost like the nihilistic, screw it all, fuck it all, like just give up on all of it kind of effort. I think for me, like that kind of view is a fundamentally anti-human perspective, just like it's like, I don't know, like what's next. And also I don't know where I saw this, but like I saw this thing where like philosophy, and I'm saying this because you obviously you've got a background in philosophy, like philosophy is not a computer science, it's a humanism. Like it's about how to live amongst others. And I think for me, that's where the best kind of philosophy does happen, even though I certainly think there's a place for, philosophy of language, math, and all of that too. Yeah, just on the thing about like the spectacle, and this is where I become really skeptical as to how I engage with politics. Like even on my podcast, what I try to do is like I try to have people on who generally are, let's say, like writers, or maybe like they've got like either they're scholars or like they're philosophers with some kind of, I don't want to call it expertise, but they kind of have done a bit of thinking and thoughtful about these matters. And like I don't want to do like I don't know, like a react video or something, because I'm kind of thinking to myself like, am I like, for instance, right? Like, okay, really good example would be the recent, not recent, I probably a couple of months ago, Mehdi Hassan was on Jubilee, and like everyone was talking about it, right? Like, I mean, and the thing is, it's really interesting. I'm sure through that spectacle, there were, I'm sure, a small number of people that were turned into more like, I'll just call it like left-wing progressive politics, which in my view is a better politics, a better way. It serves humanity better. Like I'm sure a small number of people, bought into it. And then also on top of that, there was like this, it's like the Jubilee industrial complex, right? Like, people who react videos to Jubilee, Mehdi's, this guy crazy. I'm like, okay, I mean, it is insane, but like, aren't we just treating that like some guy just insulting Mehdi to his face as like, I don't know, like a Netflix show or something? I'm like, do I want to make like even a react video and partake in that industrial complex? But the problem is then, see that this is where it becomes like a contradiction. The problem is if we kind of take like almost like the high and mighty, I'm above this role. That also, in my way, is like is an unethical act. And in a way, the only I mean, Zizek talks about this way. He's like, the only way is to like get yourself, like you find God in the dirt, in the mud, and you find sublimity, not like somewhere like an ethereal realm, like in the shit. So you got to put yourself there and fight the good fight,
I think there's even still a danger in that, right? Of being driven by these kind of narratives, but like they're almost being like a kind of narcissistic component to them as well, of like, am I just doing this because I'm viewing myself as a special person in world, like, and I think the only way, I think we just have to constantly wrestle with that, not wrestle with it in the sense of like push it out of mind, but like honestly ask ourselves like what we're being motivated and shaped by, because it's so easy, I think, to make choices for bad reasons, and we will never make our choices for completely good reasons, I don't think. But I think trying to sort of like see what those competing motivations are and sort of hold them up against our values and cling to the better part of our values that is in the spirit of the project that we're engaged in. I think that is something that just has to constantly be revisited in any of these kind of like political projects or anything someone's trying to do, even with media credit. Like if you just wanted to purely communicate like aspects of philosophy, say, right? I mean, there are channels that you can watch where it becomes a spectacle about the individual the owner of the channel rather than about the content that they're supposed to be delivering. And it's just to say that this isn't inherent to politics, but I think to any kind of avenue of engagement that people want to take, there are ways that you can sort of deceive yourself into doing something that isn't really in the spirit of the good thing that you were trying to do in the first place, and end up warping and distorting your character and things. So I think we just have to try and be brutally honest with ourselves. Also, so having people around us who can do that with us is a good thing, I think as well.
Big one. Yeah. I mean, like just to get a bit abstract here, but like in Lacanian psychoanalysis, there's a notion that like that. So and there's an analyst and the analyst. And I'm not sure what your views on psychoanalysis. Some people think it's all bullshit, but I personally think there's a lot to it. And so you go to a session and you go through this process. Sometimes it takes years, and the idea is like, okay, you've got some symptom, and at least in Lacanian theory, from what I understand, it's not that you kind of like get rid of the symptom. You just kind of, I don't know, it leaves you. The symptom is always going to persist, but the notion of transference in like the clinic is that you change your relationship with the symptom. Like you realize, like, for example, if you have, I don't know, if someone's like I don't know, if you've got like an alcohol addiction, or mostly it tends to be like addiction, but also like even in like relationships where some people they go from like one toxic relationship to another, and it's like a constantly like,
tell me about it.
Yeah, bro, all of us, man. Yeah, I mean, come on, right? So it's, I was like, some people, I mean us, and it's like the idea is that, okay, it's not that the urges or desires to do all of these self-destructive or just destructive acts go away, but you change your relationship with those. Like you realize why you're doing it, and a part of that comes from a lot of like retrospective reflection. Yeah. And it's and this is why I think what you said about having people around is really important, because like one huge thing in even in like more like carnal philosophy is that like you find yourself through the other. It's not like you do this inner work and like kind of the modern idea is you kind of reflect. It's like you find,
and then you see your cognitions and you change your cognition.
yeah. It's like I think there's something there where it's really important to it's like even reason and rationality should be like a social project, and that's why I think it's important to constantly kind of engage in through like a critical lens, though.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like with respect to the psychoanalysis stuff, I don't know that much about it, and I'm not too familiar with like the empirical basis behind it. And I know that some people dismiss stuff, but
it's not a science. It's not an empirically driven
science. That's my sort of. But then I'm also like, my view is. I mean, this is a little bit of a detour. We don't have to go down.
No, it's fine. Go ahead, man.
But my view is increasingly becoming that I'm becoming very anti-Plato. And one of Plato's distinctions that I think has been incredibly harmful is this distinction between theoretical and practical knowledge, where he says that theoretical knowledge is knowledge that's pursued for its own sake, right? And I've honestly been racking my brain over what the hell that could even mean. Like, but you're not pursuing it for its own, like you're pursuing it because you care about it in some, like there's no, it's some, but anyway, I think that distinction has been a very powerful influence in the sort of history in the Western canon, Western philosophical thought, Western theological thought. And I think it's there in the sciences today, where we hold up sort of theoretical versions of the sciences that are very disengaged from doing anything of human concern. And we sort of put the people who practice these things on a pedestal, often regardless of what their contributions are, or whether or not they are actually making. I think progress is a bit of a weird one as well in terms of a metaphor, but whether or not they're producing things that are helpful to human society or not. And now, I don't think academia should be some kind of like product mill or something like this as well. You know, I think that I think that we should support a lot of pluralistic intellectual endeavors, but I also think that a lot of people get into the theory stuff because of certain pathologies in our society, where we tell people there are these like geniuses and they have these mega minds, and you be one by studying the theory. And so this is all to say, right, to loop it back around, that when it comes to psychology, I am seeing, you know, I was talking about my girlfriend being a psychiatrist earlier, this sort of massive rift really between clinical practice, which is one of the major areas where human psychology is motivated by, you know, the science of human psychology is predominantly motivated by interventions that can help human minds. Clinical practice is the place where we medically do that, right? Like that is the place. And yet the sort of like the relationship between theory and practice is very, very weird and different, you know, because as a practitioner, you're in a political institution, you're presented with political choices about like whether you refer someone on to this unit or that unit. You're you have knowledge of like, well, if I do that, does this person even care about their role? Will this person just fob this person off around the system and then they don't get any help? You know, you have theories, and there are some empirically based theories. Interestingly, you know, things like CBT, say for depression, and behavioral activation theory are on about equivalent empirical grounds in terms of how they work for helping depression. So, but the point is that there's some theory that you can loosely apply, but where it kind of, it's still quite vague. You know, it's broadly like, oh, do something like Socratic questioning, and if you hear the client say something that is bad, like get them to reflect on that in a neutral way, right? It's very that's essentially it, and give them some kind of like tools to behave differently around those feelings, and then they can apply those. But the reality can be that when people are presenting, they don't just want that. Like they need social help, they need like financial, you know, these things also. This idea of psychology is disconnected from the systems in which someone exists and their biology, which is a part of a system in an environment and things, is just so, you know, like often poverty is a major, you know, like there are strong correlations between poverty and a lot of these mental health issues people present with. And that is because we are physiological embodied beings, and not being able to get the right nutrition, have good relationships, living in horrible conditions, have the stress of things, like all of these things impinge on our existence in various ways. And so it, you know, like almost the holistic, this is not to say discard gathering evidence, reasoning about evidence, performing experiments to understand effective interventions, but to say the actual business of doing medicine and treating people is a much more political and messy business than simply the theory. And I think that we can very often view like the theory as being the driver of everything, but actually it's a set of almost phronesis, like practical wisdom and skills that practitioners need to develop to have the, you know, to have the relevant virtues to do the right thing in the right situation, because these situations are very complicated and messy. And yeah, so I think that we should be putting more of an emphasis on practice and engineering and things like that, getting away from these kind of high polluting and I think unrealistic views of capital R realism, you know, like these representations of the world that are all theories and grand, and just get back into our, like, what's going on in our lives, right? And this person's hurting, how do we help them? And what tools do we have at our disposal? What's the evidence for those tools? And I think that is actually part of a political project as well. That's the similar approach. I think we should collapse a lot of these distinctions sort of into politics, and I think that's being forced by, as well, seeing the rise of fascism in America, where what those people are doing is destroying a lot of those distinctions which were made within a system which, I don't know, it wanted people to be blind, say, to the political basis of, say, psychiatric choices or something, because then it could justify all of its decisions in terms of nature. The same, again, going back to Plato and then through St. Paul, like, well, it's just that, the science determines that this is a disorder or that's a disorder, when really, the evaluation of whether or not a pattern of behavior someone presents with is disordered or not is based off of, cultural values that someone inhibits and adopt. Well, why is that disordered? It gets in the way of them going to a service-based job and doing a 9 to 5, so it's a disorder, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is where I really like, I would say, a lot of like more the even from like the Lacanian side, but like the feminist theorists, because like they're very clear, and like when you talk about things like a symptom or disorder or whatever it is, like it always is within let's call it a language game or like a social milieu. And importantly, and something you said about psychoanalysis, like I completely agree, like, which is why I appreciate people like you who always try to, and if you have like an idea, you operationalize it, you try to empirically verify it, because I think it's not that I like hold the scientific method in like this high Platonic ideal. I think, as you would know, it's got its own problems too. But the thing is, and really, I arrive at this more from like Louis Althusser and Zizek and all this guys. Like, okay, I'll put it this way, right? Like the Jordan Peterson types and all these people, like they constantly talk about like left-wing ideology, right? And they're like, oh, the ideologues, and then they'll like go and try to like promote Christianity, where like, can't you see that Christianity itself is an ideology? It's like the idea, it's like people really, I think a lot of us, including obviously us too, we struggle to realize that we are already in the world, or like being in the world, the way like Heidegger would put it, and that we are already, even the language we speak isn't our language. We're like intersubjective creatures, and more importantly, that our social milieu, all the way from just literally the physical things like roads to like where we are sitting, provides affordances for us to be like think and be subjects and have like some level of agency, and obviously including culture or like the symbolic things that for example, all the way from like what a traffic light would do to like a sign on the road. All of these things are providing affordances. So it's like to detach the subject or the individual from all of these things, in a way, it's almost like it becomes almost like a fiction, because that's not what human beings are. We aren't like these removed ideals from the world. And I think it's really important. I think a lot of people who kind of coming from like the neoliberal ideology, that's what they try to do. They try to like view, I don't know, rational agents, game theory, whatever, just trading, all of these things. And then what happens is, and here's what's really interesting. The thing is, you can't, like, we can come up with these grand theories of human beings in society, and like try, whatever, Austrian school, all these things, right? Like human beings act this way, and build like economic models on top of each other. But at the end of the day, you can't like the reality always seeps its head, like reality always speaks, and then you see rises of fascism, and then like you see all of these anti-immigrant, anti-trans movements, like, but why can't you like be like rational actors? Like, why can't you like and then like even the notion of like free speech, like free speech just as a that statement, it's a meaningless statement. Like, I don't even know what free speech means if people don't have if there aren't the social affordances, and like we haven't created the structures for people to speak freely and think freely. And like that's where here's where probably, I mean, I'm curious to hear your response to this, but after that, here's where I'm probably interested in the book that you recommended in one of your streams, that book, Don't Talk About Politics. I thought that was really good. And I think because she's a critical theorist, but kind of more empirically driven and through like cognitive psychology, I thought that was really good. But yeah, but before we get to that, any thoughts on what I just said?
Yeah, I don't want to. I agree with a lot of what you said. I don't want to sort of dismiss everything that the targets of my criticism would have to say about things, because there's often things they will have to say that are valuable. But I do sort of view. I think that there are a lot of almost psychological explanations that quite well explain why it is that people are doing this, and a lot of it I think is kind of like terror management, basically, right?
Interesting.
Where it seems like a lot of these attempts stem from people's sort of inability to come to terms with the fact that they are a finite, contingent creature that is vulnerable and will die, right? And so they're trying to put themselves in an ultimate perspective and provide a description of, like they're trying to manage and deal with just the constantly changing, overwhelming, crazy sort
the groundlessness of our existence.
The complete groundlessness of everything, like the fact that every single thing we do is completely on us to choose. Well, it's not completely on us, like I can't just choose to fly or whatever, but I mean, like the range of options that I have that fall on me are vast. Like I could go out tomorrow and join ISIS if I wanted to, right? Like that is something I could do. And some people do things like that. So to deal, but then also the way, you talk about these affordances, but the way that the world sort of interacts back in this crazy, ununderstandable, unpredictable way at all kinds of different levels, whether it be you get an MRSA infection and the antibiotics can't treat it, and that's this kind of like very local level on your skin or something, or through to, I don't know, the Soviet Union collapses, or Trump wins a second term and the world is just changed, and
or Trump tweets him on a jet shitting on the protesters.
Yeah, right. And it's like the world that we exist in is just insanely complex, and so I think what we often try to do to sort of, for various reasons, one is to manage our terror around it, another one is often because it helps us get things that we want as well, but is just to try to I don't know, tell ourselves a story that makes it seem like we're in control of it all, like actually we're the ones who have got it, right? And the way that we do that is by sort of mythologizing our language use, this skill that we've got, this and trying to produce a story where we're talking about the world from this perspective nobody occupies, but we label things as they are. We get to the Kantian noumenal or whatever, and you see people trying to do this through the sciences as well, right? Like people, what scientists are doing is like, I don't know, trying to change the charge of some semiconductor to see if it affects the way, some graph on some, like really specific weird stuff or whatever, is my point. But the way that like a lot of public discourse on science is conducted, or these sort of like pages like the I effing love science page or whatever, like, or even a character like Dawkins, it's all presented as this basically political worldview of like human chauvinism, and like we have described the world as it fundamentally really is. It doesn't care about your feelings. And it's like this attempt to provide a description from a perspective nobody occupies, right? Like who I think it is fundamentally incoherent, because language use is a human skill. It's not like, the world isn't providing us, it's you giving me those descriptions. And and these ideas of like a more fundamental level being physics, and then the levels stick to. I think all of that is wrong, because I think all of the levels reduce to the human, right? The human is the practitioner. Why is biology the way it is? Because humans practice it that way. Why is physics way? Not because there's a picture of the discourses that fits together with a foundational level. The foundational level is just the human's existence. But the point, I guess, that I'm making is, I think that a lot of these things are philosophical projects, and I think that what philosophical projects do is they sort of help us deconstruct how we're sort of looking at the world in weird ways and interrogate assumptions that we have. Like, I'm very critical of philosophy, but I do think it has a place, and I think that that place is more connected to morals and ethics than we often, I don't know, put emphasis on as modern practitioners of philosophy, particularly in the analytic tradition here, but sometimes in what is called the continental tradition as well, where people get too concerned about theory or being, presenting as someone who wears the right clothing and is seen as an intellectual, blah, blah, blah. Where I think what the role is kind of more like the role of a therapist, or it's like an intersection of a few categories, like therapist.
Well, Socrates say that it was like a midwife, where you kind of work with someone. I mean, the thing is, one has to be careful, because like it can be a bit condescending too. But like, I don't want to be like, oh, you little naive little fella, you know nothing about the world. Let me help you discover these truths. I don't want to be that kind of person either. I think it should be. Okay, I think he's a bit overrated, but John Maverick, he has this idea of like dialogos, like it's a constant ongoing dialogue, where it's not like you're trying to help someone discover the truth, but you're discovering a truth together, whatever that truth is. If it probably is a notional, provisional truth, nonetheless, you discover it together. And I should say here, like, you mentioned something about Kant, right? Like, that's really true, because it's like, I get this really from Henry Allison, the Kant scholar. Like, he probably wrote the best book on Kant I've sort of read. It's a difficult text. Like this idea that like when we speak of like, like what's out in the world, what's fundamental to the world, like it was really Kant which is why he calls it the Copernican revolution. It was Kant that really realized that in a way, whatever reality is, we always put that there's something that the subject, as Kant would put it, contributes to for reality to manifest, for reality to appear. So like, which is why like he was like, they say like prior to Kant, kind of in the history of philosophy, it's kind of like the naive metaphysics, where you just have like this correspondence theory to truth, where it's like, okay, whatever you believe is true just corresponds with reality. But Kant was like, no, it's not that straightforward. Like in a way, we as humans are projecting something onto reality. But the interesting thing here is, and I think here's where Kant can be misunderstood. And this is where probably I think you and I, our political side comes in. One thing really cool Henry Allison writes about is that like, when we speak of like the subject, we aren't talking about like single individuals. It's like the subject in a way is like this decentered, intersubjective thing that emerges. It's like almost like a social entity. And it's that's where subjectivity emerges through others. And as you say rightfully, even if you take like these so-called fundamental disciplines like physics or biology or whatever they may be, they still nonetheless are emerging out of through like an intersubjective process, that it's not like we're tapping into some like ideal realm out, like Platonic realm out there. So, and I think the reason it's important to understand that, in my view, is firstly, I think that's good thinking, like just purely for the sake of kind of the intellectual project, but also it does sort of shine a light on this reality, the reality of the fact that like we can't partake in any intellectual project or any kind of academic project even without kind of accounting for the fact that there is something, I mean, I'd say inherently political and ideological in what we're doing. Like we can't really escape it. That doesn't mean that it's all like, this is not like a nonsense, Jordan Peterson, everything is relative. Like it's not at all. But like, I think I haven't really got the words for it. As you can see, I'm struggling, but it's like,
it's a hard concept to communicate, I think. Yeah.
And I think sometimes literature communicates this better than even like philosophy or any kind of like analytic kind of text.
I think one thing I was thinking as you were speaking was, so initially when you were talking about the Kantian thing, right, I was kind of thinking, I was predicting where you were going, and you went in a slightly different direction. I was predicting that you would sort of say that before Kant, people weren't trapped in this like misconception, but actually you said something slightly different. Because what I was thinking, right, was, well, I don't know. I think really a lot of it goes back to is Plato again, who's my sort of in the targets of my crosshairs at the minute, where you get these sort of things like the sort of appearance reality distinction.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And also the sort of nominalization or nounification of ideas to try and find this point from which certainty can be had.
Yeah, absolute certainty.
Provides some stability to. And I was actually talking about with Camille, who's staying over, because he's obviously studying classics, and talking about like what explains why that was going on for him. And it is pretty interesting, like a few features of like the Greek language. So we were talking about, for example, a lot of the New Testament being written in Greek, and you would think that if God was going to, well, you can make the argument either way, but you might think that if God wanted to be clear about what he meant, he wouldn't use that language, because it's such a weird, messy language that's so sort of where meaning is so kind of underdetermined by what people say. Like it like words, the sentences and statements people say can sort of be taken in a lot of different ways, which in some ways creates quite fertile grounds for what we call philosophy, because there are a lot of people who we might describe as neurodiverse, right, who are kind of in that context with that language, and then they're kind of trying to they're like, what the fuck is going on, basically? Like they're trying, so they're kind of like interrogating their language and trying to like make sense of it. And that is what leads to, I think, along with a lot of other things, like Plato seems to care about the myths that he's inherited and what their role is. So you can, but that is an interesting part. But I think that he makes this mistake. I think he makes this mistake in basically finding his certainty in the eternal forms of ideas that that we have, because then this is obviously picked up and it is promoted through the Christian tradition. It gets promoted through all sorts of different things, including the Catholic Church, but including, say, the British Empire and the class system, where people read the classics. Everyone reads, and it influences thought in so much. It influences the linguistic technologies and the science we produce in so many different ways. Yeah. And I do think that, in terms of what you said about Kant, that there is a sort of very important piece of progress that I don't think goes the whole way, but towards deconstructing that view that he makes, which is that, that idea of that you can't get at the noumenal itself. Like, I think that the distinction itself is something that needs to be gotten rid of. But I think that an important sort of contribution he made, that like, don't think I would have made this myself without his, sort of thing, like I'm indebted to that, is that the noumenal is like, it's kind of like a nonsense to talk about it. Yeah. And it's coming from us. I think that where the sort of like the split between like inner and outer sort of affects this is that it's all kind of quite magical in a sense. Like, how do we project onto the world? Like, what's that? It's like, what it's like magic-y, spirit-y sort of we project onto the world. Whereas I think that what the real story is there about, well, in what sense do we project it onto the world, is the things that you were talking about earlier about, because we socialize ourselves into our language in our embodied existence in the world. Like, the sense in which our concepts are what they are, and like the world doesn't give them to us, is the sense in which we are literally taught them, and they only work to the degree that the affordances in our environments allow. So they're these, so it's this contingent set of social behaviors that we are trained into and provided with by the culture that we exist in. And so it's us humans existing as social creatures, bring that into the world, pass it down, shape it ourselves, and that we put it into the world, not like, the rocks don't make us describe them as rocks or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because like I try to not use this term, but at this point I think it's warranted. It's dialectical in the sense that like it's not like one thing comes before the other. It's not like we first project onto the world and then the world kind of, it's not causal, but there's this like almost relationship where in a way it's not us individually projecting onto the world, and nor is the world already full of meaning, or let's call it, nor is the world there that's what we're like taking in from. It's kind of, again, through the social, it's like an ongoing process. It's dialectical. But I think it was I've got to admit, man, I'm a bit embarrassed. I haven't read that much Plato. For a guy interested in philosophy, I probably should read a lot more of him, because I've been told, in fact, that if you want to really understand Kant, you got to first read Plato. And even Henry Allison in his book, he makes this point, because this is something you said, Riley. It's really good. It's really important too. I mean, in fact, you had what's his name? Is it Christoph Schrödinger, the person who a social history of analytic philosophy? Like this fact that I don't know if this is like a caricature of analytic philosophers, but there kind of is a stereotype that analytic philosophers don't account for history. And I think the good ones, philosophy very much is a tradition, right? So as you rightly point out, this distinction Kant made, or any of these ideas we're talking about, we wouldn't even be able to have this conversation if we weren't kind of trained into them, or if we weren't a part of like an historical process that's kind of constantly unfolding. And so the way I would connect this, obviously, back into kind of more of the political dialogue is that, this kind of sounds like a cliche, but politics, of course, is also like an historical project. Like so much of what we are like debating right now, a lot of these things happen due to like contingent reasons. It could be a bunch of things, right? It could be wars, colonialism, to like class things and everything. And then we're trying to like, suddenly we're like thrown into this world. And then we're trying to like figure out, like we're trying to find, okay, how do we, amongst this chaos, how do we like find a sense of self? How do we like cling on to something? And then, someone like Jordan Peterson comes back, oh, there's like these Jungian archetypes that they're the ultimate truths. And so it's people are, what was the term you used? Terror management. Like people are looking for that place to hold on to. And I think the thing though is this though, right? And I think here's where I probably would connect this back to that book, Don't Talk About Politics. So back to the concept of infrastructure or affordances. As a society, I think we can do better to build an infrastructure that allows people in a way to, firstly, I wouldn't even call it like acknowledge this like groundlessness of our existence, but rather to like allow dialogue, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like how to even engineer.
I think it's like I think it's something to do with sort of taking away people's like agency and worth, but based off of kind of like luck or something like that, where I think that's a lot of like we like give too much of a voice to someone because they say like, oh, I was a scholar at Oxford or some shit like that, as if that makes their voice, as if when it comes to like basically values where people are representing their own commitments in life socially, as if like being educated makes you a better human who should be able to make those decisions for other people. Like it's something like that, I think. But I don't. Maybe you're going in a different direction. I don't.
No, I absolutely was. Look, I think I'm not a class reductionist, but I think so much of the problems we're facing is it's class. Like so much of like all the race stuff to like the anti-immigrant stuff to this trans, whatever, right? It's so much of it is like there's symptoms of like a class antagonism, which is why it kind of really bothers me when I hear like progressives get too obsessed with like these, I don't know, like, genders and bathrooms and toilets and all that. Who gives a shit, man? Like, I mean, I just want to take a shit, I don't care. It's like it's like and I don't know. Like, so for instance, recently I had this Marxist philosopher, Daniel on, and like his whole thing was that the biggest mistake the left made was they stopped talking about class. And I think I agree. And I think so much of, in a way, so much of like these contemporary cultural issues can be analyzed through a class lens without reducing it to a class lens either. And what I mean by that is you're right in the sense that, like, yeah, class is one factor, but there are all these other more, what I would call, existential realities of being human, which also have to be acknowledged.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think whenever I talk about class, I'm definitely not sort of saying that there are these neatly divided strata of society. I'm kind of talking quite loosely about a collection of people with aligned political incentives, right? As a result of a lot of things, like, there's historical factors in there. Like, for example, in the UK, there's inherited kind of aristocracy and stuff, right? That's one thing. Yeah. But there's aligned incentives around, like, say, property ownership, or whether your income comes from, like, capital gains versus working a job, all sorts of things, right? But I think that these explanations are quite powerful for making sense of a lot of these things, because you can understand essentially why certain things happen, or how certain bad outcomes are the result of political choices that are made by a certain group of people with those aligned incentives being kind of preferred over another, right? So, and I think that this, I can speak most confidently in the UK context, but it is very closely connected to things like philosophy or things like academia, because, and this is a result, what I was talking earlier to Camille, is like, you think of, like, what society gives rise to philosophy, say, right? And it's a society built on the labor of slavery that allows people like Aristotle, the son of a wealthy chief, to have the free time.
That's so true.
to be able to write
have
and talk about
energy to, like, think, and
I think you see, I mean, maybe like doing a detour through history, right? But I definitely see the same things in, like, say, very recent English history, and I see the same things today. Frankly, tuition fees are tens of thousands of pounds per year. People who do not have parents who are supporting them cannot attend university in the UK. You just can't do it. There is no way for you to make that choice. There are student loans, but it's not enough to cover studying and living, even with a job, the types of jobs that are available for people. It is just not a possibility. Now, what I think that, so how does this kind of play out, right? In British society? Well, first off, university education becomes a necessity because of how broad it's become for almost any job that has income or the ability to give someone a good quality of life. So certain people are literally just trapped. Like, there is nothing that they can do. Maybe a couple of them get very lucky, but they are just stuck, and they will be screwed over, and they will not have the means to purchase their way out. They can't deal with health issues. They can't get rent. They can't purchase the time to study skills that would get them a different job. They're just fucked, right? But then for the people who sort of are in this system, what the education becomes is something like, well, just a ticket to work in the service-based economy, which is very miserable and alienating for a lot of people.
I was going to say that itself.
But then that means that the people who have more means, what they do is they stick around in academia more, right? So what does that do? Well, that reshapes and changes the structure of academia. So as all the incentives become geared towards the hobby projects of the wealthiest children, basically, and the products that are produced have these blind spots, often, not always, but very often, to the actual state of humans, where the academy should be the place where these human problems are being dealt with. But then, within the work system, then you've got all these people who are university educated, but they're just kind of like rotting away in service jobs. But then they become jaded and they're like, well, I just want to climb the greasy pole. And if I can get home and just feel a little bit of rest from all of this like nonsense I have to deal with, which is also very understandable. But then they're like, well, I'm going to use my knowledge of the system to invest in property and stocks, and then maybe my kid can spend a few more years in the education system and pursue the hobby thing rather. And like, I'm not saying any of this to like necessarily like blame any, like there is sort of like,
we're all in it.
There's people who, like this is just the system, which is a result of political choices. And I think and just the way that this relates back to philosophy is then, so like in that Christoph Scheringer book, right? That there is a massive blind spot within philosophy for essentially how it represents the concerns of kind of upper middle class wealthy kids who might have a certain type of intelligence. They might be kind of entertained by little crossword puzzles and things like that. But it's not then about philosophy working at this ethos of, like the seeking justice in human society and producing outputs that will be able to do that. And I think that's a real shame, because it could do that. It endlessly frustrates me, but because it's not as well like the people who get the privilege often of studying these things complete idiots or something, right? Like they have skills, they just put them to use on ridiculous problems rather than and those, again, that's where it is political, right? Because it's a political choice to say, choose to further my self-interest by pursuing a funded project on AI ethics, and like that is realistically just going to be some kind of like random nonsense that isn't actually it. But I kind of convince myself, because I tell myself a story about marginal utilities of, if we create an evil god AI, then I'm actually the most important person in the world in Nick Bostrom's sex cult talking about this stuff, right? But but on the other side of things, it's like there is like some genuine work that's quite humble that could be done, like looking at injustices in like local forms of politics or in the education system where neurodivergent people or women are being treated, you can deconstruct some you have a set of skills that will enable you to interrogate the interaction of values and language on a certain aspect of something where you could actually do a little bit. But it's like we often pursue the grandiose kind of, the philosophy narrative justifies these myths of, are you a great person like a Kant or a Descartes or a Plato, and do you have the big ideas that will shape everything, rather than what I think philosophy is best doing, which is just these kind of like quite humble, I agree with the dialogue thing that you said, but it's like there's a lot more value in making it more like an engineering discipline.
Correct. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, because you in a couple of your streams and some of the notes I took when I was listening to them, you said something like, for you, and this is you and I think we share this because kind of worldview apropos philosophy too. It's like, really the only purpose of philosophy for me is if I have concepts and theories and frameworks that give me a better understanding of the world and myself in the world, that's good enough. Like, I don't need any, I do like partaking in metaphysics and all of that. Sure. I love it. It's my obsession, but it's the best philosophy for me is kind of like what you said. It's kind of like almost like an engineering, where can we make sense of something better in a more clear way? But at the same time, then I think here's where Wittgenstein kind of mentioned, has in his autobiography, Ray Monk's one, I think he mentions this. It's like notion that like sometimes even the presuppositions we hold, philosophy is really good at like kind of questioning, what do we presuppose? So those two things are really useful. And also another thing I kind of want to run, when you were talking, I took note, is this. You said like this thing where, like, for instance, in one of your streams, you were talking about like on the YouTube channel Computer File, when they have like a computer scientist on, they'll just say, I don't know, explain some theorem, explain some algorithm, whatever, right? But then like when it comes to more like the humanities and philosophy, there's like a long biography they read, like Cambridge scholar, Oxford scholar, like this. Like they give like a huge introduction before the person even speaks, as if like all of that has like some weight.
Well, this is a product, I think, of some of the things I was describing, right? Where then, because of some of those sorts of incentives and pressures that I'm talking about on the university system, it is kind of geared towards, I mean, that pro-felicity thing. But basically, you know, this the criteria of success are whether or not you can say plausible or interesting things that will sell podcasts or make you be invited on TV shows or something. And that is an avenue of escape from the horrible forms of service-based economy labor that exist for people. For some people who can afford to just take the risks and stay, because they've got the kind of fallback to do so, they'll have housing or money, they'll be able to feed themselves, they'll have other opportunities will open, their dad has a company they can work in. So but basically what the products are that we produce are like performances, you know, like entertainment.
What do you mean by that? Interesting. That's
so, so like our philosophy, like what we produce. I mean, like look at what does, I mean, I like Philip Goff and everything, right? But he's, say, an academic philosopher. Like what is his output, right? And it's like the pinnacle of it is like appearing on a big podcast or having like a book launch that people will buy the book. It's not like did I don't know, like get people in the world to change their values with respect to this thing, or did I got, you know, the legal system to see that they were doing this thing that was harmful and now there won't be injustice as a result of that, or I gave, you know, instead it's about kind of like offering this, you know, part of the game is that people are doing this thing of like theorizing rather than living, of like kind of like what scientists do, like offering like speculative theories. And then there's these performances that can be given around those, where there are, you know, dialectically opposed positions that are offered, these I don't know, antinomies, whatever, like are you an ismist or an anti-ismist, and here's the arguments for, and people get to watch the performance and feel like something was achieved. But I feel like all we're doing with this kind of philosophy is pacifying ourselves and creating roles for people to be performance artists who become philosophers, sort of, instead of the philosopher being a role that should, in my view, be kind of like integrated in communities, providing Correct. This sort of, not quite, it's not medical, it's like, but it's like a kind of therapy, you know, it's like a weird level of analysis on what's going on, but being a shouting board for people's ideas, so that to help them stitch together these weird aspects of their life and then to reflect that back in various ways, like, it is what I think it should be.
So I'll say this, right? I think I both agree, but at the same time disagree with you in this regard. So I spoke to Simon Critchley about a year and a half ago, and he said something quite interesting. He was like, a philosopher has to be an outsider within the inside. So in the sense that, like, he was kind of playing on this idea of like the philosopher kind of being like a joker or like a bit of like this eccentric figure. And that cliche or that stereotype, it's important for someone who engages in philosophy, especially in kind of the more of the humanistic philosophy that I think you and I appreciate quite a lot. Because it's not like, because it's an interesting thing. It's like, I feel right now the modern day priests are not, you know, not these like philosophers, they're actually these self-help people, like the people like Patrick Bet-David, or like who else? I don't know, man. Self-help people. I don't even.
Andrew Huberman.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like they really are the modern day priests that like justify the pre-existing structures, you know, pre-existing systems. But then the sad thing is when you see like people who, because I think I kind of see where the allure, like, I mean, they've got these huge audiences, all of this money, all of this like praise all over. The sad thing is when I see like even philosophers kind of do that, people who probably should play more of like a provocative role where they aren't fully saying this is how things are, but rather they should be, you know, in this hermeneutic kind of lens where constantly questioning things. where in a way, and I do like the fact that in the history of Western philosophy, Socrates was put to death, because I think ultimately the philosopher, in a symbolic sense, obviously, should be put to death because they are playing this game. But then the part I agree with you is it should be done in like this stupid deconstructive, constantly like, oh, everything's meaningless, everything is like a social concept. Okay, whatever, no shit, Sherlock. But it should be done. Frankly, here's where I probably bring in Christianity, through love, through like this idea of the fact that I'm doing this because I feel we can create a better society for ourselves, not because I'm trying to like one up you or like make you feel like, oh, your stupid beliefs about your country or your religion is like it's all nonsense. Because I think that's also really destructive for like someone more in like an academic to do. If that makes sense.
I think I've part of my issues with like Plato and stuff, like I've also deconstructed Socrates a little bit, because I guess, I mean, our biggest source on him is Plato as well. And I think it's kind of like, what's it like is where this struck me the strongest was when I was trying to read Republic, and he's talking to whoever it is, Glaucon or something, I can't remember the names, and I think it's about justice or something, and he's like, oh, what is justice? And he's like, oh, well, I'm gonna go over here to help my dad who's in a court case or something. And he's like, so you gave these conditions, but is that justice? And then he's like, asked him for a different answer. He gives a different answer. That answer is inconsistent with the first one he gave, and he's like, so which is it? And then the guy's kind of getting increasingly frustrated. And the way that Plato presents this discussion is that we're sort of supposed to be impressed by what Socrates does here and think that that is a good thing. I actually think that Plato's analysis of, I mean, I have no idea if this is actually historical or whatever, but his analysis of these sorts of interactions and his presentation of them is wrong, to the degree that it's not that I think that the questioning is wrong per se, right? It's more that I think that the ordinary person talking about the answers that they produce, they are right. Like, that is, whatever they say is correct, right? I think the role of the philosopher isn't to tell people what words mean, right? Because that's what culture does to us as it raises us, and that's what society does to us, and that's what our fellow man will do to us if we. And I think that this is one of the ways in which philosophy has kind of gone wrong, is that philosophers have given themselves this idea that they have a special method for getting at like word meanings through things like conceptual analysis, counterexamples, necessary sufficient conditions, but then that with their kind of whatever they produce as a result of those methods, they then have a right to go back to people and say, no, here's what justice really means. Here's what knowledge really means. Here's what truth really means. And it is also a little bit grandiose, right? These sorts of words that are being used. I think that that shouldn't be the role of the philosopher. And to the degree to which that kind of activity pissed off the Athenians, I'm sort of, on the side of the Athenians. Oh yeah.
This is kind of what I meant. Like, I think Socrates should have been put to death.
Okay. But
was going to happen. Yeah.
But I will say that I think that what the role of the philosopher should be can be in asking those questions, not to sort of like just have the pre-established endpoint of like making people have aporia. Like, who cares if people, like, I don't want people to be confused, right? I want people to reflect on their values to see if there's like better ones that they can pull out, to try and like, that's the point. And this doesn't just have to be a bias thing. This is where it can be that two-way thing, but it's about providing that that ability to reflect from new angles and facilitate that can lead to productive and good outcomes with respect to our values and ways of thinking and talking and organizing ourselves. And that doesn't mean just doubting everything. It doesn't mean providing things that are believed with absolute certainty, but it does mean some kind of dialogical, deconstructive
process.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where, man, I really did appreciate that book. To go back to it, the one you suggested, "Don't Talk About Politics," by what's her name, Sarah Stein LeBrun. I'll leave it in the comments too for people to read. Because so one really interesting study she points at is this idea that protests, right? So protests mostly don't change people's minds, the general public. However, it does have a deeply positive impact on the people that partake in the protests. And this is where I'm kind of thinking about these ideas like social affordances, social infrastructure that allows this sort of dialogue, where it's not like this stupid Jubilee-like debate thing, but rather it's like a collaborative process to understand make sense of this crazy, bizarre groundlessness of our existence. And here's where you said something where it's kind of like an engineering problem, I think. Like it should be architecture, and frankly, okay, I have a bunch of criticisms of like the Chinese government for sure, like human rights. But I think there's something that the CCP and the state they've understood there, where they're trying to socially engineer good, positive, pro-social behavior. And it can be done. It does, require a certain sense of like authoritarianism. I completely concede that point. But nonetheless, the irony is like in the West, and here's where I think we're a bit naive. Like this like constant assertion of like individual freedom, liberalism. It's led to its complete contradiction, where now we see the rise of neo-fascist movements, right? So it's these kind of paradoxes that I think we should try and deal with in like the social sense of reasoning, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of
a lot there.
In
But,
that.
yeah.
I mean, I agree that there is some kind of like the initial justification for the individualism that's often given is because it leads to the good life, right? It's like, oh, look at the Soviet Union. They didn't have McDonald's, look at Gorbachev in a Pizza Hut advert or whatever. They didn't have that. And look at how people fled Eastern Germany. And, those criticisms, it's not like they're wrong, right? Look, there's a lot of horrible things about those systems. But I think what the problem is that we often don't acknowledge within the kind of like individualist myth is that we've created a myth that when we follow it in the way that it naively prescribes, leads to literally the destruction of all life on Earth, right?
Yeah.
Which is much worse than anything that happened in the Soviet Union. Or, on the other side of things, potentially involves things like slavery, right? Or potentially involves slavery by other names, namely oligarchy, right? Or involves such degrees of selfishness or lack of collaboration with others that it doesn't lead to the good life, because it creates all, a really good example of this paradox is driving, where there are rules on the motorway, which if everyone follows them, we can all get to where we're going very fast and safely. But because people make choices that appear to them to be in their self-interest as individuals, such as I will be safer if I sit in this lane, or if I go over here, whatever, that then means that the whole system can't work together, and the traffic clogs up, and so then you can't overtake, and you're stuck, and everyone's stuck, and everyone's doing 30 with bumper to bumper traffic rather than doing 70 in an efficient way. And it's kind of like that with the way that a lot of these individual choices in the individualist mythos kind of add up. It's not that there's no place for individual choices in free markets to lead to some kind of to lead to some kind of optimization in certain respects. The problem is, I think, is how easy it is to hijack those individual choices if you have an unjust or excessive amount of power. So tools like marketing, and you can essentially or even if you own X.com or something, like you can distort and provide people with a set of desires where their individual choices will purely be your puppet strings, right? Like you can foment revolution and wars, and you can appear on a big screen outside the House of Parliament saying violence is coming to you whether or not you like it, and these elites are out of touch, as you are a billionaire who is trying to manipulate and control the world from America, wearing a t-shirt that says what would Orwell think. So there are all these within. There's like this kind of naive myth that is absolutely contradictory, and just like, for people who believe in it, it's like, cling to that. What the thing you cared about was that getting towards the good life, and what does that look like? That isn't an ideology, right? That is a value. And so you now need to seek out what are the actions to take that bring us to that good life. They could be social, or they could come from the state in terms of putting pressures on markets to operate in certain ways. They could be individual as well. And it's about keeping clear, that's the thing I said at the start about what those values are that you're trying to optimize for, essentially, and then looking at your political choices and concerns as around that, rather than as being driven by some kind of like pre-commitment to a particular ideology or something. Then with respect to the Don't Talk About Politics book, I think that's a really interesting point about the political engagement. Like, I didn't expect that would be like that. Didn't seem intuitive to me, but I wasn't sure like what the outcomes of protests actually are. Like, I guess it makes sense that if you make sort of costly commitments, you would be more committed to a cause afterwards. And so I guess that could also be a bad thing if that cause is like a bad cause or whatever. But yeah, this definitely got me thinking that in line with what you were saying, that essentially what I think, or something that I think is important that's needed, is the ability to like get people involved and engaged in politics, but like where there are rules in the game that they're participating in that sort of enforce empathy and like intellectual honesty. And I think that part of the reason that's so important is because it will get people to see the humanity in the other that they disagree with. But I think it will also get people talking about like issues that actually affect their lives and will make them better, rather than like it's just the migrants or whatever, right? Like, what the fuck does that mean? I've seen some survey data indicating, immigration is the biggest topic to most UK voters. But when you ask people about what actually affects their lives, it's very few people say it has anything to do with, like anything that impacts them. So there's this huge disparity where, politics is being presented to us through media, the things we engage with, the channels, which comes back to what we talked about at the start about, do you engage with this? Do you not? What, like, do you fight them on their own terms? I don't really actually know what the right answer is to that, but I can identify it at least and try and promote the identification. But the point is that for vast majority of people, they're engaging with stuff at that level, and that is what is radicalizing their politics then, because their life is like a miserable experience in many respects, and then pacify themselves scrolling reels where they are told, you're feeling sad and angry, right? Look at this dirty migrant doing this and that, and that is being fed to them by an organization who knows exactly what they're doing and is pursuing the goals of some nefarious billionaire to manipulate people in that way. Not necessarily because they want to cause pogroms or something, though those may be the consequences if things don't change, but just even just because they're like, well, then they'll vote this guy in, and if this guy's in, I won't be released on the Epstein files, or I can get this guy fired who was investigating my company, like just bullshit like that, basically. And so I think that within places where we still have the democratic process and this stuff is going to be decided at the voting booth, the only way to get away from that is to somehow massively change people's mind, which I think requires them becoming involved in their politics in this empathetic, thoughtful way that isn't sensationalized bullshit. How the fuck do you do that?
In one of your streams, you were talking about this, and in fact, I even had this in our notes too. This, like, for a lack of a better term, I'll just call it the lack of lack of the limits of empiricism, or the limits of kind of statistical methods. And I'm sure you know a lot about this given your background in statistics, but like I'm not even get to like all the mathy stuff, because that's besides the point, but rather on the whole migrant thing, right? Like I really like this point Zizek has made in like his books like Plague of Fantasies, Sublime, like really good point. It's like how you can tell a lie through facts. And what he means by that is this, right? It's like this like notion that in the, during during World War II, or like when the Nazis were coming to power in the 20th century, like the propagandists would say, the Jews are exploiting people. Jews are stealing German women. And like Zizek is like, well, I hope they were. Yeah, sure. Why not go and seduce some women? That'd be great, Or like, I'm sure there was some, exploitative Jews, capitalists who were in fact swindling people and cheating people, like in every other race. So like in a way, there was some kind of empirical basis.
But just to give one example quickly of that, like they did, for example, own most of the banks, right, and were most of the moneylenders. But this was actually a product of medieval laws, which were anti-Semitic and didn't allow Jews to go into other trades and professions.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah, there you go. It's a good point. So it's like, but then they would use those facts and then tell a lie that, the Jew, capital J, Jew is the cause of all our problems. And the way I would connect this to migrants is like, in fact, I'm a first generation migrant, so I moved when I was younger. I too believe that we need to probably cut down on migration due to this reason, though. So the Department of Immigration and Citizenship did a study in 2010. Fact check me, I'll share it later on the comments. That said that what they found generally is that a good level of migration for Australia is between 180,000 to 250,000 migrants like per year. They were like, that's a good number to per year, or anyway around that number to a certain within a certain period. So right now, in fact, now the number's going down because of like all the anti-migrant stuff. It's like now about 300,000. So it's still a bit higher than what probably is the ideal amount, or like it's called the optimal amount, right? But then obviously someone could cut out this clip right now, or like take what I just said and be like, see, even these woke lefties believe there are too many migrants, and therefore like the migrant is the problem of all our causes. Like, yeah, sure. Look, we have a housing crisis in Australia, and I'm sure too much of migration is one factor, but that's one out of like 10 factors, including negative gearing, the capital gains, the tax. And the biggest factor in the whole Western world, as you would know, is like housing is treated like a speculative investment, right? Like that's the biggest factor. So it's like, and I think that's where I probably defend kind of more like philosophy and kind of the hermeneutic kind of approach, where it's like, yeah, look, you can have all the stats in the world, but if you don't create spaces for people to like thoughtfully work through them, not necessarily in like a pro versus anti kind of way, but rather more like in that, as like kumbaya as it sounds, like in a more like collaborative way, that frankly, if we don't have spaces like that, if we don't have social infrastructure like that, I don't know, man. Like we might be going towards like a World War III or something. The current state, the current trajectory of the world.
Yeah, I personally, I do think that statistics provides a very good set of tools, right, for like
no doubt
reasoning about things. But I do think it is very philosophical. What like basically interpreting your measure, like it's hermeneutic. You always are interpreting your measures, what your data means, what the inferences mean, and how those inferences relate to the domain that they are supposed to be operationalized over, right? So all of those things are hermeneutic things, which are why I don't think you can get it. Now, by being more trained in those skills, you can cultivate the ability to spot errors, or have like more easily see mistakes, or when things have been done right, or have more confidence, those sorts of things. So I wouldn't but I also think that I wouldn't put like blind trust in any of those things. Like I think that this is one of the mistakes of analytic philosophy in the Platonic tradition, and now when they talk about Bayesianism not having a clue what they're doing,
Especially when it comes to like theology, I hate when the debates this, base that. They try to like, it's like almost like they try to cover up their stupidity by like math talk.
Yeah. And I think it's literally the same as if you had like an argument and you were like, oh, well, the scales of truth weigh on my side or something. Like just some kind of like metaphor of comparison where like you're like, but I believe the thing I believe, and the comparative metaphor made it so. But the metaphor is like likelihood ratios or something. You're like, oh, ratio, like you're doing science now.
Science.
But I do think there's a few people who have kind of tackled this topic. One of them is a book called something like Statistics as Principled Argument from like the 60s or 70s. And there's also a more recent book. Oh, I've forgotten the author's name, but it's like Statistics Wars or something. And basically, and her name has a G in it. So, I'm not giving you a lot of information there. But basically her point is that there have been a lot of these attempts within statistics to, or is it Deborah Mayo, I think, is the author? I don't know if that's Mayo statistics book. Is that it? Statistical Inferences, Severe Testing. Yeah, that's it. Where she talks about basically, you have like your inferences. You have your inferences that are about the world, and you essentially put them under a series of severe tests. But all of those tests are like basically tools, right, in the human toolbox. That so there's no kind of position from which you can a priori get to Platonic heaven and find out if the frequentist or Bayesian interpretation is true. And those are just sort of even myths that you can tell about what it is that you're doing that will justify the use of those tools. But really, the proof of whether or not those tools are the right ones that work for you is going to be whether or not they enable you to do the thing that you're doing. So the point is, there's all sorts of pitfalls and contingencies in the use and deployment of these methods to look out for. I think they're very good and should be used more. But they also can't save us from like hermeneutic problems and philosophical problems. I mean, even within statistics, there's often value-based questions that come up, right? So like this is a big driver in psychiatry. Was a lot of these methods were quite new around the Victorian era, and a lot of people were kind of quite straightforwardly say applying concepts such as normal, average, and then saying well, if I have some kind of measure of behavior in a population in Victorian England at the time, well then I can take what's normal and I can then define deviation, right, as deviancy from that. And so now we've got kind of like a way of scientifically using the tools of statistics classifying this behavior as deviant. Now the question never arises of like, why is deviating from this behavior bad? Why is being very close to the average behavior in Victorian England good? Is Victorian English society? These are all philosophical. These are all like philosophical, hermeneutic, value-based questions, and I think that we can't get away from those. And you're right to point out that when it comes to, I think this was at the heart of what you were talking about with like these immigration questions, is that there will be statistics, there will be hermeneutic questions in those statistics, like how do we interpret them? This doesn't provide us with skepticism just to dismiss it, but it means that it's not just knockdown. We have to be careful. And then there are going to be value questions about like, well, what are the implications in terms of, our political values that we care about here? Is even if that empirical finding would push in one direction, does that conflict with other values we think that we should be trying to create in society? I don't know, like we might care about, we might have an idea of sort of ideological fitness, right? And think that actually we should have exposure to way more different things. So we might have an idea of like individual freedoms and autonomy, or of being part of an international community. I'm not necessarily advocating for any of these things specifically, but just highlighting that there are going to be competing values and how they interact with each other to draw a conclusion about statistics in a political context is going to be a philosophical question that needs to be answered. So there's always going to be some role, I think, for that is not decidable in a scientific or rigorous methodological way. There's like messiness to all these things.
No doubt. I mean, also just a slight point here would be Mel Andrews, this philosopher of science, wrote this paper called one of my favorite, the reanimation of pseudoscience in machine learning and its ethical repercussions. I do recommend that too, because along the lines of what you're saying, now the big thing is like, oh, AI can run a democracy, AI can take care of our legal system,
and it's going to fix the economy as well. When the productivity from AI kicks in, it's going to be
like
crazy.
all that bullshit, right? So it's like there's this pseudoscience coming up there. Nathan, I don't know, we're a bit over time, but I really want to ask you a few questions about British politics. Have you got about 15-20 minutes more?
I think if you don't mind, if we could go maybe like try and aim for like 10 or something, just because I'm a bit hungry and I've got to get to bed.
Oh yeah, of course, it's pretty late there,
I'm happy
right?
for us to talk again, though. Obviously, like it's literally just that I'm kind of tired and having.
Oh, dude, I totally get it, because you've been going on for a while. I just realized that you also were streaming before this. So, I mean, look, man, I know. Let me just keep it really simple. I just would like to touch on that only because, in many ways, you've become my like UK politics commentator now. Like I get from you and then like Navarro Media on what's going on. So this, I think I shared this with you, right? Oh, sorry, that's my uni assignment. Where's this? So I shared this video by Navarro, and then I also on Facebook. And then I also shared this one by Jimmy the Giant. I really like his stuff too. So then two big things that this person, Nathan, who's one of my Facebook friends, his name's also Nathan, brought up was one thing was the obviously huge problem, the grooming gang scandal, which involved certain, I guess, immigrant groups, and also the failure of the British system. So I don't know if you can talk about this in like 10 minutes, a little big discussion. And the other thing was, it's interesting, while we were kind of discussing back and forth, he was talking about like, oh, there's going to be Sharia law in the UK and all of this stuff. And then here's the part where I think you would find it quite interesting. So I asked the person, replied to my thing about the comment here, and he was like, oh, there's going to be blasphemy laws in the UK and whatnot. And then this person said, the irony of your post, when within 48 hours of writing it, there was another Islamic terrorist attack in the UK at a Jewish synagogue, which took place, where 2 Jews died. And then he said, Daniel, then you're making this very silly. And then he also said here, the proof is in the crime, not opinion. So I thought that was a good example of like how you can take something that empirically really happened, and then through that tell a lie, the lie of, I don't know, that there's going to be like an Sharia law in the UK or like some kind of Islamic theocracy. But I'm just curious, like, have you, because you do engage with like a lot of people like this, like what is your kind of MO generally, or do you just like avoid them entirely?
No, but I think that the only way to have success in these types of interactions, and this is where there's no way of me saying this that doesn't sound like patronizing, right? But
I was going to say, even I sounded patronizing saying these people and all of that. I don't mean it that way, but yeah.
I mean, I often think that so the not patronizing part would be to say that often there are reasons why someone would be so motivated to adopt these views, and they will be bad feelings they have about the world, and those are real, right? Like, they can be caused by many things that are not Muslims trying to create Sharia law in the UK, but those feelings themselves are real, and diagnosing those is like complicated. Like, it could be because they are in a, like, say, low income area or something, and so they are seeing like a kind of fracturing of society, right? Where in a low income area, you will often also have like immigrants will be in that area because it's low income. So they're also kind of getting screwed over, right? And so, but then because of the way we live, there's a breakdown of like social centers and cohesion. We don't live in a way where we encourage any kind of interaction with people. We live our individual lives isolated on our devices. And so what this person will be doing is seeing that will be providing him with targeted content towards his character. I'm not saying it's this, but this person could be a different thing as well, but it will be about, say, those topics, and then they will just be seeing a person they don't know of an ethnicity they're not familiar with in their neighborhood, and then feeling bad because of like economic depravity in the area. And so you can see how they can make sense of it. Another thing is sort of like similar, but it can be people who say are like in like decent middle class areas that are like predominantly white, but because of their engagement, they're very scared like of a number of things. Like, I mean, climate change seems to be pretty freaky, war with Russia, the collapse of international order and rule of law with, you know, like Trump's policies and things like, and all of those things are terrifying. And I think it can make people, again, just reach for like wanting a sense of control. And they know they've got in their world their nice white community that they understand. And they are being told stories that are scary about the world. And a part of those stories will be, well, there's this thing of immigration that's bringing all the nasty problems. They're coming to you, it's coming to you. And I have seen more brown people, and, you know, there was I don't know, they celebrated Diwali at my daughter's school. Oh my God, you know, you can't even fly a flag. But then you can see it, how it kind of like, maybe some of those views, it's like, I can sort of see it, but then it's like, what, now people are getting mad at them flying the British flag in Britain, like they've gone to, you know. And so you sort of end up just in this isolated community of beliefs where anyone who disagrees with you is immediately castigated. And I think that, in my view, the overall way of dealing with this is, just because the emotions are so high, this is nothing to do with the humanity of the person, whatever, is that you kind of need to approach it therapeutically. Like you need to kind of give these people tools through dialogue that isn't even challenging the beliefs. It's like, it's literally will be either repeating back statements they say that are incredibly aggressive, but asking them to reflect on that, hearing it from another mouth or something, or asking them like what sort of, if there's like anything they could see that would change their mind, like say if they saw a migrant like save a cat or give out a free, would they then be like, they're good people, you know? Just not like, even as I said that, it sounded kind of acute. You've got to like ask it in this really like treading on eggshells, babying this. And this is where some frustration in me comes from, because I've dealt with a lot of these people, and you really have to like baby their emotions basically, because they're so radical. Yeah. But that, I think, is the only way to get them to a place where they can have the adult conversation about what is true, because they can't do it while they're so like emotionally fragile, basically.
Yeah. I mean, look, I know you're hungry and you got to get going, but I'll just say this: like, I've never really ever engaged with this sort of thing on Facebook, or it's a worse place to have this discussion. But like with this person, I would absolutely try and work them through it, except if it's like, I think a part of it is also knowing that it's a lost cause. And I know that sounds very cynical, but like if the person starts talking about, I don't know, white nativism or something, I'm like, I really don't know if me, a brown fella, what I can do, you know, to convince this person.
Well,
and I would say this, right? Like, for example, I was reading this book by Hein de Haas called How Migration Really Works. Excellent book. Like, it's very social science driven. And this whole thing about there's this one point he makes that, compared to, you know, in human movement, human history, in fact, right now, it's not true that migration is at an all-time high. It's actually quite low compared to like the 20th century. The difference, though, is there's a lot of non-European migrants moving into Europe and like other typically white countries, or like European countries. So of course, I mean, you see kind of the other is, you feel like the other is there. And then on top of that, there are all of these other conditions of like the economy, you know, as you say, the wars and the Putin, Russia, whatever, Gaza, Israel. And then it's like, you need to find some kind of symbolic scapegoat, right? And then it's quite convenient to blame it on the trans person or the migrant or like the Muslim. Because like one thing I was thinking was like, I asked this person like, okay, I think the UK has 4 or 5 million Muslims, or like a huge number of Muslims. So what are you going to do with all of them? Like if they're the root of the root of all your troubles, like I don't know.
I'll tell you, there's a good tool to have in your arsenal of these sorts of discussions is there's an article that Sam Harris wrote around 2004 where he makes the exact same point that people are making now, where he says, due to demographic replacement, at current rates, Muslims will have taken over by France by like 2024. And so it's like, and they're still a minority, right? And it's just because you can't, it's not like rabbit breeding populations where I don't know, like like they make a bunch of assumptions in the way that they frame. So they'll be like, oh, if there's like a large increase in Muslims this year, now we just extrapolate that and like keep going. It's not the way, like there's often like a specific cause for a lot of migration, or something. For example, in the UK, right, a lot of our illegal migration has been driven specifically because we left the EU.
Yeah, it's increased since Brexit, right? Yeah,
and that's because we were able previously, we were part of a scheme where if people entered the UK as part of the EU, we'd be able to return them to the first country that they entered. But we can't do that anymore. So people know this, and then they come here. And then there's a lot of other factors, like the Conservatives deliberately sort of didn't process migration applications. They made a big basically because of a couple of things. One thing was that they could make like cruelty displays out of it. So they built like a concrete barge on like a river that was like had migrants in it. It was like, look, we're being like firm on this issue. But they also knew that it was a wedge issue, that if they dealt with it and it went away, they wouldn't have that in their back pocket to bring up at an election, say, well, you can't trust Labour on immigration. We'll deal with immigration. So the UK, I mean, there's differences between every country, right, on this, but for the UK, the conversation is so misleading because like 50% of the migration into the UK is actually students, right? So those students,
Australia,
they're paying their student fees. They're actually net contributors because they pay their rent and they pay value-added tax on everything they buy. So even if they're not working, they're still just putting in money essentially to the UK economy. You can argue about other effects and whether those are positive or not, but at least the economic argument just doesn't have legs there. Then the vast majority of other migrants, even non-EU migrants, are actually net contributors to the system. The main reason behind this economically is because we do not support their being raised through the state the same way we do for British children. Like the cost of raising a child to the state is an immense cost that is almost not wiped out for the average British person paying taxes until they're sort of in their mid-40s almost, right? Now, for people who migrate over here, they're immediately contributing in taxes, every single penny and also if they're in their like 20s, right, they're not using this public services like the NHS for their health. And so this meme of like fighting age males is actually ideal because those fighting age males are exactly the type of people that will work long hours and not be sick and use it. So it's kind of the economic arguments just don't have legs. That there's a bunch of for the UK. This is I can't speak for other places because I've not looked into it. But for the UK, there is something in the vicinity of about 150 billion in tax revenues that would be wiped out if we just stopped all immigration. The small boat crossings as well. It's quite a complicated thing. I mean, there's still not actually that many, right? It is quite a small amount, but it's quite complicated what the incentives are around that. So, for example, I mean, the fact that there aren't any legal, easy ways to cross, if you're one of these migrants, that actually creates an industry of people trafficking because it's very profitable, right? So, like one of like Zach Polanski, who's a Green Party, one of the ideas he's been promoting is the idea of actually just having publicly funded ferries, right? Now, it sounds weird because you'd think, why would we be shipping over these people? But the fact is that if you didn't have any monetary incentive for those boat journeys, which is what there is, right? People pay something like it's like £5,000 to £10,000, something like that, right? Then there is no money for these criminal gangs to arrange, who are the people who run these camps, traffic people, smuggle them, arrange. And so you just don't get the same levels of travel. Like they essentially sell these things as like package holidays almost, from places in the Middle East or Africa to like get you into the UK. You pay the money and then you're kind of like in that. If you take away the money from that, it's just not there. Those criminal gangs, they can't continue their operations. And I'm not saying you wouldn't get any, but it's one of those weird, like almost like opposite effects. Where whereby like it's like almost like with drugs, where when you kind of criminalize it, you create this weird kind of set of dynamics that then criminals will make this whole situation a lot worse because of what their incentives are, and it's very profitable for them to do that.
Yeah. I mean, look, man. Last two things I'll say because you've got to get dinner. Sorry, man. So in this book, right, friends behind your house, he makes a really good point that he points at the exact kind of paradox you made, which is that this, especially in the US, from the research is done, once they started enforcing more stricter, like more like almost like a militaristic border control, the number of illegal migrants increased because it went underground. It became like this, like people smuggling and that kind of thing, and it ended up serving the course of the in this case real criminals who are like smuggling people and doing these things. And the other thing is the point he makes is that now in Australia we really don't have an illegal migrant problem at all because we're an island. Like we rarely have any. It's mostly visa overstays. But the other thing he makes is that like this is again where the whole like Twitter culture war thing is brought into it. The number of either undocumented immigrants or like illegal, whatever you may call them, refugees, it's a lot lower in Europe than in the US. The US is a country that has the most number of these like mass refugees and stuff, or like what's the best I guess undocumented immigrants coming in. So it's like I think that's where, like, for example, this person here, I'd never have this kind of conversation with that person on Facebook, but I would try to engage with them in person for sure. Now, I don't even know if it can be you can have that discussion on like this kind of empirical level, because as you said,
I don't think you can yet. But that's where I say like what I think they essentially need are like people to just be friends with them from those cultures or whatever. Like when I think about the times when I went down like the Jordan Peterson right-wing rabbit hole
when I was like 19 or 20,
and it led me to a lot of like these sort of I don't know if I was exactly like an ethno-nationalist or something, but I definitely thought that European culture, which was like in some way which was in some way connected to like the genes of white people. I didn't have like I hadn't really thought it through much, to be fair, but was like superior to other cultures, right? And but like when I think about a lot of my engagements with other people, like like I had a friend whose family had immigrated from Iran, and he was just like nice to talk to and empathize with things in my life. Like I had another friend who was from Jordan, and just him being like it made it hard for me to take like a final step towards the alienation of I needed a bit more than that to deconstruct from this stuff. But I do think that having those things made it hard for me to like step right off the deep end into like the territory of these people are just like inherently
kind of. It's certainly, there's a lot to get there. In fact, a small provocation here, and then I'll shut up. Sorry, I keep pulling you back. I in fact do believe that Western or European culture has some level of what I would call superiority, but in this regard, it's exactly what more like these right-wing conservative people would be against, which is like the scientific method, skepticism, this like constant like Cartesian self-doubting. I do think that's a really important thing that came out of the Enlightenment in Europe in the 17th century. But the problem is people that do defend so-called Western values would probably never, engage in that kind of like constant questioning, Cartesian skepticism. There's, scientific method, and they probably wouldn't really want to engage in that, but they'd probably speak about this like vague notion of some like Christian nationalism or something.
Yeah, I also think that there are some things that are like good about Western cultures.
Oh, totally. I mean, moved here as a kid for a reason, right? So
I think what the issue is like sort of like the Western cultures haven't matured in proportion to their technological advancements. So I don't know if you've read like David Graeber's book, A New History of Everything or something like that.
No, I haven't. Yeah, I read the Bullshit Jobs, but not that. That's his big one, right? A New History.
Yeah, there's some cool bits in that I found interesting, where he even talks about Enlightenment authors being influenced by contact with like indigenous people in America, and he highlights, like, using primary sources, a lot of quotes of Native American people criticizing Western sort of like concepts of society and values and things. And a lot of those are even related to like individual freedoms and things. It's like, so almost like a lot of kind of mockery of like, you call yourself free because you can build this and do that, but actually, you're kind of like in a sort of slavery to this lifestyle and society. And look, this isn't to also, go full noble savage or whatever. I mean, he does talk about like the influences on Rousseau, but it's not to, their societies had their flaws as well, and I'm sure they would have been better off with penicillin, which they didn't have, right? But I think that there's often a kind of moral maturity for certain things that we just don't have, because we're so concerned with accumulating capital and status that we've often lost a lot of like things that are important, compassion. And even to bring it back to like what you were saying about feminism earlier, like I've been thinking a lot recently, like how much of this is almost like an encouragement of the most negative aspects of male competitiveness, where like women's perspectives often include a lot more like social nuance and compassion and things, and actually we maybe a lot of what we need is actually compassionate women in leadership positions making choices that are about those blind spots that we kind of culturally have.
Yeah, I'm pro DEI, not because I care about women or minorities, because I care about our society. Like I want to survive, and I think more DEI would make it a better, more pro-social society. Yeah.
No, I think that rather than surviving, we should have like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos just get as rich as they can, and let's just see how rich they can get before we die. I think that would actually just be better.
That's the moral of the.
Let's see how big of an LLM they can make. Like how
So how much of water can we use from all of the villages that are currently not having, because of the big data centers, not having like the water going off and then the power going off?
That's more interesting than all life ever on Earth, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, mate, this has been an utter delight. I'll actually end this stream now and say goodbye to the audience. But let's see, end stream.